Hello and welcome back to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and this is my colleague and co-host, Sam Wang.
Hi there, Sam Wang, professor of neuroscience and founder of the Princeton Election Consortium.
So our mail system, our postal system, is a political issue that has been discussed many times and in many ways in the last few months during the pandemic, although often mail is something we don't really think about. Now it's something that we're not just thinking about, but we're thinking about the system behind it. Mail-in voting, for example, has been front and center in debates about how should the nation prepare for the 2020 election and what kinds of changes and resources will that entail. Mail is at the center of our economy, where many goods have been going back and forth, not through stores, but through our postal system. And the postal system itself has been under budgetary threat from Washington right when we need it most. So we rarely think about mail, but it is central to our daily lives. In some ways, we're more aware of that than ever before as we try to live and survive through this pandemic. And the state of our postal system in the coming years is really going to be quite an important issue. And today, to discuss this, we have on one of my favorite historians, Richard John. Richard John's a historian at Columbia University's School of Journalism, where he teaches in the Ph.D. program in communications. He's also a member of Columbia's history department, where he teaches courses on the history of capitalism and the history of communications. He's edited several books. He's written numerous essays, and he's the author of Spreading the News, the American Postal System from Franklin to Morse, and Network Nation, Inventing American Telecommunications, both really fantastic books that had a huge impact on the field of American political history. He has many honors and awards, fellowships all over the world, and he's received several awards, including the Allan Nevins Prize from the Society of American Historians and the Herman Krooss Prize from the Business History Conference, and the first Ralph Gomory Book Prize in Business History for Network Nation, and much, much more. But I want to use our time, so let me just welcome you, Richard, to our show.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, Julian and Sam.
Maybe we can just start with the kind of origins question of why did the elected officials of our nation create the postal system? When was it created, and what was the goal of the founders?
The post office, in a most straightforward sense, is identical with the founding of the country. And the founding of the country goes back before the Constitution. 1775, the Continental Congress establishes a post office. Ben Franklin is first Postmaster General. But the institution received a new mandate following the adoption of the Constitution. And for this reason, I find it misleading that so many, including the post office itself, goes back to Benjamin Franklin. Because in fact, Franklin's vision for the post office was very little different. The vision for the post office, the British Empire. It was a revenue-generating institution for a teeny elite to facilitate the circulation of commercial information. It had a fiscal mandate. Franklin was praised for bringing in more money to the crown. All this changes after the adoption of the federal constitution. James Madison's essays on the Federalist, called the Federalist Essays rather, 1787-88, to try to encourage the New Yorkers to support the Constitution, did not use the phrase public opinion. He didn't envision communications being a tool for democratic self-government. In fact, in Federalist 10, he contends that poor communications will help to keep the Union together because it will prevent groups from organizing to conspire against the public good. Well, a lot happened between 1788, when the Constitution is officially adopted, and 1792, when the foundational Post Office Act is enacted. In particular, what happened is that lawmakers, New York, and Philadelphia, they discover that they need to find a way to relate directly to the citizenry. It isn't enough simply to go home when they're not in office, Congress is not in session, to speak with their constituents. Instead, they begin to envision, this is particularly opposition leaders like Madison, who's in the opposition in 91, 92, opposition leaders see that it's important to mobilize the public to challenge the powers that be. Now, there's a second factor, and that is the Federalists, who were in power at this time, saw newspapers as a way to unite the country, to create what the political scientist Benedict Anderson called imagined community. So the real founding of the post office, in my opinion, is not in 1775, but is in 1792, when Congress enacts the first law to put the post office, to institutionalize the provision in the Constitution, Congress shall establish post offices and post roads, to put it on a permanent footing. There are three provisions of the Act. I won't go on long about these, but they're each quite important. First, every newspaper published in the country is admitted into the mail on a non-preferential basis. Now, that was controversial. The Federalists wanted to only admit newspapers that were, in effect, official. In other words, the government would broadcast what the news was, and the citizenry would then learn what was going on in the seat of power. Madison opposed that. Every newspaper on a non-preferential basis and at very, very low rates. Newspaper, maybe a penny, penny and a half to send it from New York to New Orleans. Letter could cost 50 cents, even though newspapers are much bigger. Extraordinary subsidy to promote the circulation of information and public affairs. Second, and this is of great importance today, though often overlooked, that Congress retains control over the development strategy of the post office. That is to say, Congress does not permit the Postmaster General and the executive to decide how the network will expand, which routes will be established under law. Instead, Congress says, we're going to retain control over that. And a mechanism evolves very quickly. Ordinary Americans petition Congress for new post routes. Implication is they'll get post offices, so the Postmaster General actually retains control of the post office part of it. So these petitions are almost never rejected.
Yeah.
So the network expands willy-nilly from the seaboard to the hinterland. There'll be some listeners who remember, or they've heard of something called the Boston Post Road. That was the chain or link. That was the post office that Franklin knew. But after 1792, it becomes a network, and it expands into the hinterland on a scale that was unprecedented any other country. You can compare with Britain, you can compare with France. And the third, and I'll just say two sentences about it, is that Congress mandated that no one has permission to open letters. So the norm of privacy. So those are the three key principles, the 1792 Act, which is foundational. That's what the founders intended. That is to say, non-preferential access to newspapers, rapid expansion into the hinterland because Congress is in control, and therefore the citizenry has a voice, and the norm that we would later come to call privacy, a word that's not in use at that time.
And then you wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, which was titled, "The Founders Never Intended the U.S. Postal Service to be Managed Like a Business." This is connected to the threats that the postal system is facing, including President Trump, who's called it a joke and been very hostile. And you argue that until the 1960s, you say Congress routinely covered whatever deficits the Postal Service incurred, no matter how large. And you say because the Postal Service was a public service whose rationale was civic rather than commercial. So fast forwarding to where we are and connecting it to this idea, what did you mean by that? Why is that relevant, and what are you trying to argue?
Well, I've been thinking about the post office over the long span. And of course, it's changed dramatically. We have the internet. The post office delivers parcels. Lots of things have changed that the founders couldn't possibly have had in mind. But there is a DNA to the institution. And the DNA is that it has a civic mandate. The goal is to bind the nation together. You can bind the nation together in many different ways. And in fact, the ways that you can bind the nation together have shifted radically. There was principled opposition to the post office expanding its mandate to include the circulation of parcels, for example. Post office is about information, not parcels. But that mandate is distinct from the claim that the institution should be run on business principles, in the sense that it should only serve profitable markets, it should be free to pull out of a market if that market is no longer lucrative, and that it in fact could move entirely out of its original market if it so chose, because of the tight connection with Congress, that it is a fundamental principle of governance that the circulation of information shall be conducted on a basis that will serve the entire population, and not that it'll meet some short-term or even long-term commercial rationale. The idea that the post office should be run like a business was discussed by lawmakers on multiple occasions in the 20th century, debates that almost nobody reads, and every time it was rejected. The idea was that the post office has a mandate to provide basic facilities. It's infrastructure. It's like water. Basic infrastructure that would make it incomprehensible to subject it to the same kind of expectations that, for example, we would use when trying to evaluate even a parcel delivery business like FedEx or a UPS. It was different. The founders understood that that was the case, and that understanding pretty much persisted through the 60s. It's a surprise to many listeners and readers that the post office ran deficits from the 1850s to the 1960s, and almost no one cared. It was not a political issue. Presidents didn't get up on their high horse and say the post office is being mismanaged, it shouldn't run in such and such a way. It wasn't a political issue. And that's one of the fascinating aspects of our current moment, is that the President of the United States has made it into a political issue in a way that it's hard for me to find precedents for.
It seems to me that presidents before have talked about inefficiency in the post office going back to the Reagan era. So it feels to me like this has been building for some time. And I wonder if I could just ask you a few things about that. These deficits that nobody cared about before, do you recall about how big they were? Were they notable in budgetary terms?
Multi-million-dollar deficits. I actually looked up the numbers. You could run the percentages in terms of the federal budget. They were substantial in the late 19th and early 20th century.
So big by standards then, but people put up with it anyway.
People put up with it, yep.
And so it sounds to me like, I guess my reaction to the history that you've given us is that people are mixed up about the role of the post office, and that there's a national role, a civic role. And I'm wondering, is there some kind of way to remind people about that, to remind them of a nationalist rationale for having a strong post office?
Well, the post office, according to the recent surveys I've seen, I think it was Pew, is the most popular federal government institution. So some Americans get the message. And
more than the military?
It was 80-90%. Yeah, I could get that data.
I mean, I do like my mail carrier. I see. And so so they're popular now, but I guess is the question then how to demix up our policymakers then? Right.
Part of the issue is that policymakers and pundits and journalists tend to be located in the big cities. And in the big cities, post office's importance is not as self-evident as it is in small towns, rural areas, in parts of the country that are sometimes disparagingly called flyover country. And for this reason, it's been extremely hard to build a political coalition to challenge the position of the post office, because many congressmen—
Because urban dwellers don't get it.
Yeah, and red state congressmen are recognized, Alaskan congressmen recognize, Democrat, Republican, how important the post office is to their constituents.
You'd think that would make it easier to build a coalition across the party aisle.
It is. There is a coalition, and that's why I believe, if we're predicting, I'm not in the forecasting business, but I think the post office in the end will get its money and it'll continue to operate.
So what kinds of, you said that Congress retains control over the development strategy of the post office, so it's in that respect not a private company.
Right.
What do you reckon are easy to pass or easy to agree upon rules to expand the post office to improve their soundness?
Yeah, this is a great question. A couple of years ago, 6-day delivery was an issue. If the Postmaster General believes that we should abandon 6-day delivery, go to 5-day delivery, sure, let them try. Congress won't permit that. There could be some consolidation. That's going to cause problems in rural areas. And it may not be that that's where the real cost savings is to be found. The issue that, as I see it, is that lobbyists, understandably, that's what they're in the business to do, block the post office from going into sectors that might be lucrative or that might enable it to better use its facilities. Postal banking is one. Some kind of broadband access is another. These are areas that have been debated and discussed, even using post offices for more purposes. Post offices used to be country stores. It was a mixed use. That has gone out of fashion, and in fact, an awful lot of businesses don't want to see the post office muscling in on their activity. So the institution is hamstrung in the way that ordinary businesses are not, but I don't even like to conceive of it as a business, because I wouldn't go so far as to say that lawmakers made a wrong turn in the 1960s. The Capitol Commission that led to the U.S. Postal Service was predicated on the idea the monopoly should be preserved. The institution has a mandate to serve all. Let's make it more businesslike. That was fine, but they didn't give the post office the kind of discretion that it needed. It may well be that Congress will never permit it the kind of discretion that is needed. So therefore, we're going to more or less lumber along as we have in the past.
It feels like banking would be low-hanging fruit, though, because there are ways to do that.
We had a postal banking system for much of the 20th century. The Japanese still do. 6% of American people are unbanked today. Credit is a central agent of innovation in our economy. It seemed to be a no-brainer. That's a hard argument to make in Congress, though, because of the power of banking lobbies.
Pardon my ignorance. This is my last question. My questions are getting more and more naive, and then we can step it up with Julian with smarter questions. But why is it that people resist sending parcels by post office? I actually, just to get very personal, it is hard for me to get people to send things by U.S. Postal Service. Like my assistant, for instance, she's constitutionally not wired to use the Postal Service. What happened there?
Right. Well, Federal Express and UPS have a leaner operation. They do not have the kind of penetration, kind of range, depth the post office does. So it's more consumer oriented. It's also much more expensive. Your assistant may not be that concerned about cost. Why are there so many long lines in the post office to send parcels? Because there's a lot of people in this country for whom cost really matters.
Sure. When I mailed books, book rate is a miracle of shipping.
There you go. And you also are claiming that FedEx and UPS are separate from the post office, whereas in fact they often work together. So you don't see that the post office is being used by FedEx and UPS, but it often is. So those are last mile, and sometimes long distance carriage. They're complicated contracts that they've entered into over the course of many, many years. You think half the world's mail is the United States mail, half the world. So there's all kinds of institutional arrangements to move a parcel from one place to another. But I do think that last mile, is an area where the post office has an advantage and could, I think, expand for the public good.
No, so if you tell this story that from the 19th century, the 1960s, you have this bipartisan consensus around this system. Funding is smooth, even if they are spending more than they have. We all agree this is a civic institution. So part of the story we've been listening to you tell is kind of the Reagan Revolution story and a new understanding of public goods and the importance of privatization. But then there's technological changes that did create competition, even if they're not as cheap and not as efficient. You do have FedEx and UPS. You have email, which took away the letter, which was fundamental. I mean, isn't that part of why the mail system, the postal system, struggles politically in ways that it didn't have to pre-1960? And is there ways to overcome that?
The post office does struggle email, internet is a huge challenge. Whether or not it struggles politically is an interesting question. That is to say, will congressmen get together and make the privatization of the post office a plank in, say, Republican Party platform? Will they? It hasn't happened yet. Could happen. I don't do the future. Hasn't happened in the past. It is an easy target for some of the reasons that Sam was suggesting, because we use it so much and we all have horror stories. But you then have to begin to ask, well, what about the statistical background here? What percentage of postal items actually go through? And it's pretty high and it's pretty effective. So there is a political challenge in that it's easy to criticize. And that's what President Trump, who's very good at picking things to criticize and you get support behind. Whether or not there will be a coalition in Congress to close the doors, to eliminate mail delivery, is another question. And if that happens, who is going to pick up the pieces? I'm a historian, I'm not a prophet, but Amazon is going to be looking into moving into last mile distribution. And is that what the American people want? It seems to me, without having done a systematic study of it, that the post office may be more popular than Amazon if we're talking about powers that are expanding their range in ways that could be threatening to the public good.
How important, can I ask you a little separate question, but how important is the postman and postwoman to the popularity you talked about earlier? I mean, there's not many government bodies that have a person associated with it. I don't mean you go to the DMV and whoever you end up with helps you. This is the person you know, they come to your house, you're familiar with, it's the same person over time. I mean, is that really important to the politics of this?
That's a good question. Years ago, I read a piece in Washington Monthly, and I'm trying to remember the author, that you hate the clerk in the post office, but you love your letter carrier.
Yeah.
You have some relationship with your letter carrier. I think that does matter, and in part it matters because letter carriers go lots of places that FedEx trucks and UPS trucks don't, or if they do, it's at a very high cost. Remember, we did not have the norm in 1792 of uniform rates, but we have had the norm of uniform rates for a very long time. And that distinguishes post office from FedEx and UPS. There's no presumption of uniform rates. So the post office is going to have a presence in many parts of the country where it would be prohibitively expensive for FedEx and UPS to have a presence. There are lobbyists at FedEx and UPS, or at least there were until a couple of years ago, who were very worried about the post office going under because they feared that they then might be obliged to pick up the mandate that the post office was no longer able to maintain.
And then back to where we are right now. So there is a threat from the administration, though, even though you interestingly pointed out that the mail is more popular in many red states and rural areas, traditionally anti-government areas, than you'd expect. So we can say Trump doesn't like the mail for whatever reason. The president doesn't like the postal system. But if we step back, where is that animosity, that political pushback coming from? What is the coalition against mail right now?
Well, I've thought about this, and it's not a subject I've done a lot of research on, but with Capel in the 1960s, there was an effort, AT&T, to promote a vision of business that was regulated, but that was under the control of management and not government. And there has been, as you know better than I do, having read your fault lines, there is an ideological movement to delegitimize the concept of the public good, to delegitimize the idea that there are certain services that are better provided for by government than by corporations. And there's been a teeny number of libertarians who have been extremely intent upon challenging prerogatives of the post office for a long time, going back, Sam, you're right, say even to the 1960s, 1950s. But it's a teeny number. There's no popular movement. For decades, I've been trying to find evidence of popular hostility to the post office going back to the 19th century. That's what I was originally going to write my dissertation about. But with the exception of the period between 1837 and 1845, when there was an enormous amount of popular hostility to the post office and the calls for privatization, whole 9 yards, it's very hard to find those public expressions. It was more common in the 1870s and 80s to claim that the post office should take over the telegraph giant Western Union than that the telegraph giant Western Union should be expanded to take over the post office.
Oh, so back then the post office was well thought of enough to be considered a good national institution.
Oh, it was not only a good national institution, it was one of the triumphs of civilization. Andrew Carnegie would say as much. Journalists said this again and again. Lawmakers. It was a kind of a cliche that it was even claimed to be an element of civilization to rank with the printing press and the mariner's compass. 19th century journalists.
I mean, there is that science fiction movie, The Postman, where a man like finds a discarded postal uniform and uses that and starts to rebuild civilization. This makes me think. This makes me think of Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean, and I seem to recall we interviewed her some time back. It feels like the idea here is that there was something that happened, I guess was the 1980s, when the post office was not quite privatized, but spun off in a way that made it look more like a business, which gets back to what you were saying about Capel, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound right?
That's right. It's 1960s. There was trouble in the post office. There was a crisis in Chicago. The mail was delayed for months, and there was a kind of a racial, ethnic dimension to that. We need to do something. And the something was to streamline it, to make it more like a business. And one of the key changes in 1970, and not all your listeners, viewers may be aware of this, is that the post office was no longer a line item in the federal budget. So the post office is not, Congress does not debate year after year how much money the post office should get. The post office takes on debt. And that's different. That was a fundamental restructuring in 1970. That's when I would date the shift to, and then there were also changes in the post office that were quite consequential. Life magazine, Look magazine were destroyed within a period of about a year or two because of changes in postal rates for magazines. We got away from big subsidies for those magazines. Late 60s.
It's hard to mail those big things?
Because they increased the rates.
I see. So 1970. So around that time, did the role of the Postmaster General change? Because it seems to me that this is a little bit peculiar that we have this entity that is in some sense supposed to stand on its own financially, at least according to popular belief. And yet the Postmaster General is a government official. So what authority does the Postmaster General have post-1970?
That's a good question. Larry O'Brien was campaign manager for Lyndon Johnson. I think I got that right, Julian.
He was his legislative person.
Yeah, but he was a key politico, and he became postmaster.
One of the most political Democrats of the Johnson administration. He was the guy who worked Congress.
Right, and that's the kind of person who became Postmaster General.
Like a political appointee, like a donor or whatever.
It was often the head of the party. It was often 1970 that changed.
The head of he's the guy they're breaking into in the Watergate burglary.
Right.
The head of the DNC.
Really well connected, pulse, and reliable. Those were the Postmaster Generals. It was often said you could tell who the Postmaster General would be, that is to say, as a member of the cabinet, as the Postmaster General was in the cabinet for 1970, it was the first person you could tell who was going to be because it would be the head of the party. All right, 1970, depoliticized, or ostensibly, they talked about getting rid of the name Postmaster General. Actually talked about that since the early 20th century. It's a really old title, but they kept it on. But they have now a new agency, the Postal Rate Commission or Postal Regulatory Commission, which was supposed to provide the oversight that Congress had provided. So it was an administrative agency modeled on the other administrative agencies from that period, like for example the ICC, which is now gone, and the Postal Regulatory Commission's function has shifted. But the idea was to take it out of politics and to run it in a more streamlined, nonpartisan, civic-minded way, independent of the vagaries of every 4 years election cycle. So that was the vision. It didn't quite work out that way, in part because Congress retained such a lively interest in the institution, and in part because of the changes that Julian's described. No one in 1970 predicted the coming of the internet or any of the other technical changes that have utterly upended our information infrastructure.
I hesitate because you're such an optimist about the post office and its possibilities, but my question is along the lines of whether the Postmaster General can do something that adversely affects its operations quickly. And I realize that this is not a very sunny question, but we seem to be living in a pretty unusual time.
Yes, I mean, as a historian, all I can do is look at what's happened in the past. There were lawmakers in the 1840s when they were in the opposition who wanted to privatize the post office, Levy-Woodbury. When Levy-Woodbury ended up in front of a jury, the issue was postal monopoly, which would have affected post office bottom line, changes his tune. What negative things could the Postmaster General do? Well, sure, you could politicize that $500 billion. You could say we're going to use that for COVID relief. You could begin shuttering post offices across the land and hope that Congress won't respond. You could lay off large numbers of postal employees in defiance of all union agreements.
Cost cutting, man.
Cost cutting. Will that happen? Don't know. But that's what an incoming Postmaster General could do. If the Postmaster General speaks to constituents, speaks to congressmen in red states, and gets a better understanding of how the institution operates on the ground as opposed to how he thinks it operates on the basis of libertarian kind of tracks, then he may develop a different assumption. He may become domesticated, as it were, in the argument of critics. But that might not happen too. It could be a political football. The administration has said flat out that if lots of people vote, Republicans are going to lose. In effect, the platform has been established for opposing mail-in voting in the fall. And I think that would be very serious. But, after I did my Washington Post op-ed, I got letters from veterans who say this. They've tried 6 different delivery outlets for getting their medicine. Needs 8 kinds of medicine. Only the post office delivers. And that was a sentiment that you're going to hear if you leave Washington, D.C. So I would hope the incoming Postmaster General would get outside of the Beltway and begin to look at the quote-unquote real Americans who depend on the post office every day.
And it would be, we're almost out of time, but if there is a shift to mail-in voting in most states, if this pandemic results in a sea change in how we conduct our elections, this would be I'm assuming it's done through the Postal Service, like it's not privatized to FedEx to mail in our ballots. This would be a kind of a historic milestone then, correct, for the postal system in terms of its political import.
Correct. And it's going to be extraordinarily important for the legitimacy of the electoral process that the American public has confidence in the impartiality of the postal clerks, of the administrators, up the line, the managers in those big city offices, that they're going to do a fair job. And that should be a priority of the incoming Postmaster General, because if the election lacks legitimacy, that's going to have consequences that are going to extend long beyond who wins and who loses.
Well, our guest today, again, has been Professor Richard John of Columbia University, the Journalism School, as well as the History Department. He's the author of Spreading the News and Network Nation, 2 really phenomenal books that you can still get everywhere, and you should get. Richard has been talking about the mail longer than anyone I have known in a serious way, and it's always interesting to me. I'm sure he would tell you, he's been on the receiving end of many jokes about his interest in the mail, but what you always learn during these kinds of conversations again and again is the import of this as a really basic part of our government and our political history. And as we said at the beginning, right now it's in front of us, just how relevant this is to our democracy and to our economy. And we'll be talking more about this, I'm sure. So, Richard, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks very much, Julian. Thanks, Sam. I enjoyed it a lot.
And once again, you can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Spotify, as well as the Woodrow Wilson School webpage. And we also have a website, politicspolls.princeton.edu, with all the show archives, contact information for guests, and any other information, I guess, that is out there. So thanks for joining us, everyone, and we will be back soon on Politics and Polls.
Bye, everybody.